Yeah, my public school had that through third through fifth. I was in a.
Oh, that's interesting.
So we were all in the same teacher all 3 years, and so.
Yep.
Yeah,
My
I
husband
think.
had that too at his public school.
Yeah,
Small
I guess the thing
towns.
is like with the one room schoolhouse, like if you had to choose, I mean, what if you got a stinky kind of mean farty guy in your
Like the
class?
teacher? Oh.
No, just like, oh man, I hate this guy. And it's like, well, you know what? Next year I'll have a new class. It's like, no, you're with that fucking guy for the rest every year. You know, like I hate this kid, you know, like. Okay, so let's record the intro now.
So what did Milkless? Because I think we start with the name.
Two dads, we love our kids, but then we also need them to know that we're like pretty cool and it's not like a wimpy podcast. So, hey, hey, Milkless.
Hey, welcome. Hey,
Milkless. Call the audience, Milkless. What's up, Milkless? Max coming at you.
What if that's it? That's our first take.
All right, Matt, we are back live via satellite. Not really, but you know what I mean. We are here with a guest. We have Bettina Schultz-Jobe with us. Matt, why don't you kick us off and let us know what we're getting into today?
Yeah, you bet. Well, what we're going to ultimately be talking about is kind of alternatives to the kind of standard public schooling system. Bettina, you run a hybrid school that we're going to talk much more about. But before we get into that, because we have the highest of journalistic standards here at Milkless, I have to acknowledge that you also founded the Natural Lifemanship Institute, where my wife works. There is a personal connection. It's the only reason we were able to book you as a guest, frankly. But so the Natural Lifemanship Institute, I'll give you my husband's understanding. You guys train therapists and equine professionals, as well as schools. I know you've done work in the corporate world on experiential modalities of relational therapy, communication, etc. I know that through that work, you've worked with the public school system a fair amount, trying to, kind of teach them some trauma-informed methods for dealing with kiddos. And it seems like an outgrowth of that is when it was time for you to send your own kids to school. You couldn't really find anything that was meeting your standards and doing what you want to do with your kids. So now you have started a school of your own on the piece of land that you work from.
I really do believe that there are pros and cons to whatever direction you head. We give up something to get something else. That's just the way it is. And I grew up in the public school system, and I did really well there in many ways. Very academically, did great, and it served me well in life, right? And so good, rigorous education and our children being able to go as far in their education as they want to is really important to me and to my husband as well, right? So when we think about the options that are out there, and there's really a lot available right now. And what I'm gonna do, because this is the way my brain's gonna work, is I'm gonna start with like the least control from anybody else, which would be pure homeschooling. I'm gonna start on that end and then move up, and then we've got on one end, we've got pure homeschooling, which means I, as the parent, am home with my kids, teaching them at home. Okay, so that's homeschooling. And then on the other far end of the spectrum would be public school. I am that doesn't mean I'm not involved in their education, but I'm not really choosing the curriculums they're doing. I'm not choosing what we're doing, because generally speaking, there's a certain way they're doing that. And I'm supporting whatever it is they're doing in the public school setting, right? So those are the two extremes. So if you start on the homeschool end of things, the next step up from homeschool would be something people will call homeschool co-ops or homeschool pods. What that usually means is people who are homeschooling come together and they participate together in education, right? So we just started that a year and a half ago. We haven't done it before, but we're doing a homeschool co-op where what that means is I have to be there with the kids, or I have to send somebody else, which in my case I have to sometimes since I work, with them to go, right? And so like this last semester, I taught an anatomy and physiology class to 4th through 6th graders, and then to the 7th through 12th graders. So they're getting one of their sciences out of the way with me teaching that. That's my expertise. So I get to teach something I'm an expert at. And lots of homeschool co-ops have that. So you can go learn engineering from somebody who is an engineer, for example, or whatever. That's your co-op. That's still in the homeschool world. Then as we move a little bit higher, you'll see things that are called hybrid homeschools, which is what our school currently is, right? So hybrid homeschool still falls under, and there's a lot of these popping up. And they're looking all different ways. You'll see something called the university model, which is a hybrid homeschool. So a hybrid homeschool is still, according to the government, it still falls underneath the homeschooling realm. So according to the government, you're still homeschooling. But it's where we first started with our kiddos, was a hybrid homeschool, not when we were running. So our oldest, he first went to a hybrid homeschool, and I can talk more about that in a minute and why. But he did 3 days a week at a school with other kids with licensed or certified teachers there. And they had a curriculum they were using, and then they would send homework to do 2 days a week. And on those 2 days, we were homeschooling our kids, okay? Within those hybrid homeschool models, sometimes there's very little individualized education, like there's a curriculum picked and you then do exactly what they send you to do on those 2 days home, right? Sometimes there's a lot more but you do tend to, as the parent, have a little more input. Like you go, you know what, actually, this way of learning math, because there's a bazillion ways to learn it, not working well for my kid. And I think if we tried this other one that I've been researching, and the school might use a whole different way of doing math, for example, right? Well, hybrid homeschool usually means a certain number of days at school with other teachers and other kids. And within those hybrid homeschools, they will often still have things like lots of different social things that they do together. You know, it varies. Homeschool co-ops do this too. So like our homeschool co-op, I'm about ready to start doing some bonus classes about science projects and the scientific method, and we're going to have a science fair because they're growing, because there's so many now, right?
How many people in that class? Just like that anatomy class, roughly?
Yeah, I had 10 in one class and 11 in the other. So they're usually smaller, although ours is growing, and I think they're going to cap out at like 15 per class.
Okay.
That's still smaller than some public schools are that small, but that's still smaller than most public.
So would love your take on this, because here's my like visceral reaction is just like, you know, the kind of trope, maybe Matt and I have said it over the episodes, just like, you know, that one homeschool kid who kind of showed up sophomore year in high school, and it's like deer in the headlights, like overwhelmed. And maybe they were socialized in a little co-op and they had 5 or 10 friends, and now they're in a high school of 800 people, which is basically like an airport or the rest of your life, kind of in some ways. And it's like overwhelmed, doesn't know how to navigate that thing. Also, just like I considered homeschooling, but I ultimately felt like it would have been kind of like a selfish decision, because I love my kids so much, I miss them so much, and like I want to be around them all the time, and like, I have the ability to do that, and I was just like, it's just like I feel like you rob them of like school pizza parties and field days, and that day when we throw water balloons with the PE teacher, like all those memories of just like, I don't know.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So my husband and I, we talked about all of this. There was lots of conversation when we first started this, right? About what we wanted to do. So here's what I'll say. Number one to that is that, I grew up in the time also when we thought homeschoolers were weird, and they had less opportunity to socialize. I will say that. Back in the 70s, about 1.5% of the world was homeschooling, right? And it was also much more, there was a certain demographic. And so oftentimes kids were a bit more isolated, right? Like at the home, inside the home, right?
It's I feel like you're being so diplomatic. It was like preppers who like lived. Yeah.
But also, even today, like more than 50% of homeschoolers, just for some data to round us out as we're diving in here, cite religious reasons.
Exactly.
And moral reasons. So it's like, and
It's changing. It is changing. So now we're looking at it's at least 50%. It used to be probably almost 100, right?
Yeah.
Like that 1% had more to do with maybe very conservative Christian or religious beliefs, right? And I would say, depending on where you are in the world, you'll see more of that or less of that. What we are seeing statistically, if you look it up, right, is that a lot more people are homeschooling for other reasons. So we did not homeschool for religious beliefs. That was not the reason that we wanted to do it. We wanted to do it because we wanted to be able to educate differently. So in one of the reasons we switched was because we were traveling a lot for work at the time with our oldest. And that meant we were going to be either hiring somebody to take care of the kids so they could be in the public school 5 days a week, or we were going to let them travel with us. We wanted them to have the experience of traveling with us, not all the time, but twice a month. We left on a Thursday
On
afternoon.
horseback?
So they had to, our kiddo had to be in airports, had to interact with people, had to go to the training with us and interact with adults and talk with people and meet new people and see new places and still do his 3 days a week, right? So what you'll see right now too is there are a lot of people there. It's called world schooling or road schooling. I hear that language used a lot in the homeschooling world. So let me preface a little bit with saying we've never done what I would call purely homeschooling. It's always made me feel a little out of place in the homeschooling world because I work full time, right? And so we have had to hire people to help us. Like even when we did the 2 homeschool days, I couldn't always do it. Neither could Tim. We were working. So then, we had somebody else to help at times. Or we were doing stuff like once we arrived over in North Carolina for a training, right? And so what we were trying to find was what felt well-rounded. That's what we wanted to do.
Yeah, and that to me, that's out of necessity, and that's like great, like, like you got to make it work.
And so a lot of people are working remotely now, and I think it's part of why this is happening, where they're working all different places, and so there's a big movement in the road schooling, world schooling, right? Which is we want our kids to go to the places to learn about the history, for example, and in it, again, this is experience, right? In this very hands-on kind of way, be experiencing the world and having more access to lots of people. So here's what I will say is when you start looking, homeschooling has been quite researched now for about 20 years. And most of what we think we believe about homeschooling, when you really do look at the data, it's myths, right? It's not what we think or what we grew up with is not what's really happening anymore in the homeschool world. So a lot of times children who are being homeschooled are having a lot of so our school, I'll also say this, it's a micro school. So I didn't get that far on our lists of things, but we're a micro school, which is a 1-room schoolhouse. So we have all different ages, which means our little girl who's 6 is often learning with kids who are 10 and 11. Now that means and they are needing to help her at times, right? Like there's different ways that we learn among ages, which is, we would argue in the micro school world, my bias about that is that there's very few times in life that we need to go spend all day long with 30 people exactly our age and development level and figure out how to operate with them. Right? In the work environment, we have a variety of ages. We have to learn how to operate with different generations and different people. And so the argument often is that this micro school thing, which by the way is how we educated for kind of hundreds of years before the population continued to grow, right? We had 1-room schoolhouses is where people learned. And so there's a movement back to that. And
Montessori is a 3-year. My oldest daughter has been in Montessori since she was 4. And she was in the same class 4 to 6, and she just started a new class that has 7 and 9-year-olds in it. So there's some of that in there.
Yeah.
Yeah, my public school had that through 3rd through 5th. I was in
Oh, that's interesting.
so we were all in the same teacher all 3 years, and so.
Yep.
Yeah,
My husband had that too at his public school.
Yeah,
Small
I guess
towns.
the thing is like with the 1-room schoolhouse, like if you had to choose, I mean, what if you got a stinky kind of mean farty guy in your class?
The teacher?
No, just like, oh man, I hate this guy. And it's like, well, you know what? next year I'll have a new class. It's like, no, you're with that fucking guy for the rest every year. Like I hate this kid, like that. Sometimes with a big sea, a fish, that's interesting. Right. You can find your people. And it's like, if you're kind of a weirdo, if there's 200 kids in your thing, you find that other weirdo and you guys are doing Magic the Gathering, playing Dungeons and Dragons. Like it's, you find your people sometimes.
100%. It's the biggest in my mind. It's the biggest downside. And it's also part of what's positive about it, right? Mm-hmm. Is that, so this is to me, my husband and I talked about this a bunch and Tim said this all the time, but what if the one kid, he's only got one other kid in that whole class, when Cooper started kindergarten, he was pretty small, right? And turns out he is still best friends with that kiddo. They've both got other friends now. They're best friends. But man, it could have not been like that. Mm-hmm. And we were concerned. So, that's one of the downsides, I would argue. I would also say that there are a lot of kids that really struggle during a certain developmental stage to find their place. Right. So like as a therapist, the number of adults that I am still working through middle school trauma with is high.
Middle school's rough, man.
And so many children, what they have to do to actually fit in that environment is not necessarily functional behavior that's going to serve them well in the rest of their whole entire lives. Some kids, it's great. This is why you've got to know your kids.
Yeah. And that's why, I think where I'll probably end on it is just that, obviously it's just a family decision and there is no right decision. There's probably a really, really shitty public school for some people. It's like, oh my God, your kid's going to get fucking stabbed in there. It's a bad situation. Teachers suck, whatever. And there's another place where the homeschool also sucks because it's super religious and the parents aren't qualified and the kids are, it's not good for them. And then there's the opposite on both. Amazing public schools with incredible programs, incredible community around it, incredible homeschooling situations. So
that's right.
It's going to be whatever. I mean, but the one thing that there's a piece of data that's sticking out to me that before we get to that kumbaya moment, and there's a Pew Research piece of data that says 83% cite concern about the school environment, such as safety, drugs, or negative peer pressure. And that to me is just I like your reasoning. We wanted to teach a different way in terms of a positive whatever. This, unless it's really a dangerous school, I don't know. That just seems like negative peer pressure, drugs. I mean, you got to face the world, right? This is the world. The world is going to be there.
I think that is and we've talked about this in other contexts before. This tension that I sometimes feel as a parent between raising my kids based on a certain set of ideals that I believe in and that I believe on some basic level lead to human flourishing, and then also when you grow up, you got to live in this world, which is not that world. And even in Montessori, you'll hear that a lot. That but what about when they just have to do something? Yep. And 100%, we do better at every phase of our life when we can move and when we can learn experientially and when we can, but also the best paying jobs are computer jobs, mostly.
Sometimes, yep.
So and I'm not trying to advocate for one or the other of those. I'm more trying to just call out that tension that I often feel as a parent that shows up in a million different ways.
This episode is brought to you by the Milkless Patreon. If you want to keep listening, it's only going to cost $79.99 per month. We're going entirely offline, so you can no longer listen unless you pay $79.99 per month. Just kidding, it's fucking free. We're actually losing money on the episodes, but we love doing it for you. All we want is for you to tell a friend. Think about that one friend who listens to podcasts. They told you about serial podcasts. They told you about, and it's tell them about one.
Yeah.
And it's milkless.
Just return the favor. The $79.99 does get you feet pics from Max. So if you're into that.
What we know is that the brain does not fully develop until 20s. And I recently read something that it's even late. It just keeps getting later.
Yeah.
Later
Yeah.
for the boys.
Yeah, especially Maxie and I are still getting there. We're working on it.
Yeah, I'm close.
I mean,
I'm almost
like,
fully formed.
I saw something where it's like almost 30, you know, I mean, so
Yeah.
the thing is we're talking about the neocortex. It's the like executive functioning, the most outer regions of the brain are right here in the front. That's what's developing last. That's the part of the brain that's responsible for concrete and abstract thought and like decision making, right? So the question becomes, and this is the decision every parent has to make, is what do we do to help our children's brains optimally develop so that they can make good decisions in the world, right? So our oldest was in we haven't been, not with our kids, we haven't been in public school, but he was in a private school that did education very similar to public school.
Okay.
They'd probably claim it's not the same as public school, but there's like a definite definition of how education can happen in different ways. It was more like public, right? And man, you know, we stayed for a whole year because, you know, the question always is when do I support my kids in the hard stuff? Because life is hard. And that's how we build resilience, is by doing hard things. I mean, even trees, we were just recently told you got to take all those ties off the trees because the only way that tree becomes resilient is it's got to be smacked by the wind and it's got to figure out how to deal with it, right? Like even trees have to be like that. And when do you remove the stressful thing because you need to scaffold the learning? That's too much. That's going to be too much for this kid. Every kid is different.
They're
right?
outside the zone of proximal development. This is a term that Max and I learned.
Yeah.
That's right. They're out of the learning zone.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
They're out of the ability to really be able to learn and embody anything. And what can happen in some settings is that everything becomes about this social stressors and the ways that we're even take our nervous systems taking that in. And if those lower regions of your brain are what's engaged all the time, sort of the survival movement centers, you're not learning really. You're not integrating it into your brain, right? And so, you know, it's one of the reasons we teach what we teach at Natural Lifemanship is I feel really passionate about parents really understanding this stuff, understanding how the brain develops, what is optimal, and that way then they can begin this process of really attuning to their kids, because every single kid is going to be different. I keep saying, I think our youngest will be the one who's like, I want to go to public school, you know, later, because she want to do sports and be around a bunch of other kids, and that'll be her maybe, right? And we'll talk about it when the time rises.
Yeah, I guess the thing is, like, with this stat of like, you know, maybe choosing public school because of negative peer pressure and fear and like basically coddling the child. It's like, sure, if there's a kid being, you know, bullied like crazy, that they're out of the zone of proximal development, that is trauma, that is abuse, that is horrible. But the stuff that I see, even just like in public school parents, where a kid has one negative reaction, one negative experience, and then it's like immediately to the teacher or to the coach. And it's like this huge thing. I'm going to pull my kid out. And it's like, what happened?
Yeah,
One kid said, you have like a poopy face. And it's like, now it's like, oh, huge. It's like, fucking deal with it.
Yeah.
You know,
there's a term, bulldozer parent is the new term. And apparently, which is like, there's the hover parent or the helicopter parent. The bulldozer parent is just like any resistance to their child, they just clear out. And you're hearing like college professors are like, I'm getting emails from my student's mom that they want to change classes because it's too hard. So that is, I think, the cautionary tale on the extreme other side.
Yeah.
But
also,
But I think sometimes we see these things as like as binary and in conflict about like you're either a bulldozer parent or you're like a totally hands-off, you know, like just let them deal with it. And Maxie, this reminds me of something we talked about when we spent a lot of time talking about like building grit and resilience. It's like, how do you expose your kids to situations that are difficult and challenging for them but you aren't the hard part, or the relationship isn't the hard part.
Right.
Like, I wonder if there's a more nuanced way to think about exposing your kids to friction or to headwinds or whatever you want to call it.
What we had said on that episode was like, basically, first check, is it abuse? Is it
Step
like,
one.
is it abuse, or is it like overwhelming? Okay, no. If they're in the zone of proximal development, it's relatively normal life. Then you're their quarterback, headphone in the ear, coaching them through. Okay, here's what we're gonna, maybe like this, maybe like that, maybe doing some breath work, maybe like talking about, role playing, or talking through the logic of it.
Well, yeah, and this is what secure attachment is, right? Like when we haven't talked about that much. When we talk about the kind of attachment that we know children need in order to do well and flourish in life, in their adult relationships even, right? It's not that there wasn't any stress. In fact, it's the opposite of that, right? When you talk about grit and resilience, you have to have the stress. It's just that you can't be alone in it. You got to be supported. You have to believe someone's got your back. My parents have got my back. That doesn't mean they're going to bulldoze in and fix it for me. It means they're here to support me. They're not going to fix it. They're going to be supportive of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is a slight change of subject, but as y'all were talking, I was thinking about, the reasons, because I do know, I get this. So I think a lot of people, when you say 86%, this is what they're saying. It's because they're scared, because we're seeing stories, right? We see stories about kids that have been severely bullied. The bullying has changed because now it's on social media, right? We have a lot of research on how bad this gets for kiddos. I think back to middle school, and if there had been social media, this had been really bad,
I do not envy kids now. No.
It was hard enough, right?
Yeah.
So parents are scared. There's school shootings. We're scared. There's a lot more to worry about from a actual safety perspective than I think people worried about, 50 years ago, right? And those things can start, as a mom, of course, those things can, I know when there's been school shootings, I remember, when there've been more local school shootings, feeling scared to send my kid to school the next day.
Yeah.
Just feeling that way, right?
No, that's more legit than the drugs or negative peer pressure.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah. And we know about all of it now. We hear every single bad thing that happens everywhere.
Exactly.
So whether it's actually more dangerous, we certainly perceive it to be.
We perceive it to be, yeah.
Yeah.
And so but when I think about why it is that we wanted to do something differently, it had a lot to do with that I really want my kids and the kids in our school to really love learning and to learn how to learn, not how to regurgitate information, not how to memorize stuff and do the bare minimum to get the A or the C or whatever they're trying to get, not how to, a lot of that happens, right? And when we were working in the public school setting, there were lots of things that we were there to help with. That's why they asked us to be there, right? And there were people doing great work there's such good teachers. I mean, everywhere I've ever been, there's great teachers, right? And I saw kid after kid after kid after kid who claimed to hate school. And it's a high percentage. They don't like it. They don't want to be there. And they'll say, I like sports. I hate all the subjects. What's your favorite subject? I don't like any of them. It's a high number of children. And having been a therapist, also working with kids, what's your favorite thing? What do you want to be when you grow up? The number of kids who claim to hate learning is disturbing, because that's not the case when they're 2 and 3. They're sponges. They're eating it all up. They love learning. They're out there experiencing and pulling it in. They're sucking it in their beings, right? Something happens along the way in the way that we're doing education that starts shutting down that natural love for learning. Not everywhere. I'm not saying it's everywhere. I just recently was talking about this with my dad, who has Alzheimer's, and he was like, I can tell you this. I never, ever wanted to go to school one day in my whole entire life. He's like, so if you have kids who like school, there's something happening, right?
Yeah.
And so I think there are intentional things that we can do to because for me, with our kiddos, right, as long as they got to learn the basic stuff. They got to know how to read. They're going to have to sit down and read, right? I mean, they got to know math. You got to sit down and actually write it out and do that. There's stuff you have to do. They're going to have to learn reading, writing, arithmetic. But if along the way what we're doing is teaching them to hate learning, then they're not going to go, they're not going to know how to learn and go out and do the things. And it's a huge percentage of our kiddos. Now, I think the love for learning can happen in the family environment. But what I watched with our oldest was he's a sponge. This kiddo is like, finds something he likes and he just finds an interest and he goes so deep into learning it. And then we can do writing and public speaking and we can do a business around it. We can do all the things around the thing he loves doing, right?
Sounds like your oldest, Max. Yeah.
He is an avid learner. And what happened is one year in a more traditional setting where there was more sitting, there was less like inquiry-based learning, less project-based learning, less learning that really made sense for why we're doing it, right? So like, for example, the school he went to, they were doing, his favorite subject's always been science. And they were doing botany. And the first month they had to basically memorize a bunch of the phylums and all the weird words for all the things. And I was like, go outside and see the plants to learn the plants, you know? They weren't doing as much of the hands-on. And he told me all of a sudden he hates science. I was like, what? My kiddos loved science. For his whole life loved science. And he loved all the subjects. And in 1 year, within about 6 months, he was doing what everybody else does, right? Like, school's not fun. I hate it. I don't want to go. I don't like learning things. What subjects do you like? Really, none of them. Just apathy. And I see that. I'm not saying it's all the kids. But I watched him and I was like, okay, that's not because I know Tim and I both are like, we know our kiddo. That's just not our kiddo. And I don't want him to, I don't want him to think that he's just going through the motions all the way through college, right? And so it's the number one thing we see when new kiddos come into our learning environment is that we're trying to undo the bad attitude about learning. We're trying to undo it. So we have a kiddo in our school right now. He's so adorable. He's so fun. But like his first week, everything, no matter what you asked, everything was boring. He didn't like any of it. And I kept saying, okay, at this school, we like learning. And here's what we do to help with that. And here's why, right? We have to undo it. The other thing that we're seeing in a lot of more traditional schooling, and it's not everywhere, but we see that either you've checked out because you're not getting good grades, like it's hard for you to get the grades everybody else is getting, or you don't have to do your best to get the A, right? We've got a kiddo like that at our school right now. He's like to do the bare minimum every time to get the A. So we do assessments at our school, but we're not doing grades. There's a ton of research on when we start giving things like grades and any reinforcers, how much we take away the intrinsic motivation. That's like been researched forever.
Yeah. The only thing for me though, the counterpoint is like the thing that sounds the difference there is just a good teacher.
Yeah.
Like, what if it was a shitty science teacher that like sucks the marrow out of life? Or is that a positive thing? Maybe you suck the marrow out of life and are just a really good teacher, which I think you can get in either forum.
I think you can. I do think that there are some systemic things that you'll hear teachers say all the time in the more public school setting. You will hear teachers say, we don't get to teach the way we want to teach.
We got to teach to the test. Yeah.
We don't get to use our creativity. We don't get to go outside of the curriculum. We don't get to really let kids, like, for example, they got to memorize the phylum. We can't take the time to go just walk around for several hours and find the plants and stuff, right? And so the systemic thing, right? And it's not happening in all countries either, right? There's public education in other countries that are doing it a little bit differently. Now I know we have a little public school right down the road from us that I've heard really good things about. So I'm not saying it's everywhere, but I do think there's a systemic thing that affects the teachers being able to do that, and also when education can be more individualized, we get to find an interest and then learn all the subjects within an interest. So then what we're learning is making more sense to us, right? So like even the spelling words that our kids are doing are in line with another book that they're reading, which is then in line with the thing they're learning about the history or that country they're learning. Like it's all coming together, doing a lot more like unit learning and lots of reading. And so, you know, even in some settings, kids are reading a lot less. Research shows we need more reading. They're reading a lot less because they're spending a lot of time doing worksheets and busy work because you've got too many, you have I mean, if you're teaching 20 kids at a time, you can't individualize it very well. It's just the nature of the beast, right? And that's not saying it's bad. That's sort of the other side, of that argument.
Yeah, one thing that stuck out to me, because I was reading through the materials that you sent on your school, and there was a sentence in there it was something like, education is always selective. You're always choosing to learn some things and to not learn other things. And I think because public education has kind of been the baseline for so long, it becomes the default. And so we tend to think if you move outside of public education, well, you're not learning all these things that are part of the default. And it's like, yeah, but the default is, in the default, you're not learning all these other things that you might pick up in another setting. And one of the things that I think about a lot, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. When I have problems collaborating with people in a work setting, it is, I would say sometimes it's because they suck at their job or they're goofballs, but more often it is because while they
were homeschooled. Yeah.
Maxie.
Homeschooled.
More often it's because they're too weird for me to talk to them. No, more often they're plenty capable, they're plenty smart, they know their job, but they got some like weird hang up, whether it's their insecurity makes them suddenly be ego driven and it's more important that it be their idea than that it be good, or whether, whatever it is. I find that like the problems that I see, and a lot of our clients are like big companies, right? So, it's funny, like I was at the cafeteria for the Austin Meta office, and I was like, we weren't working with them, I was just meeting a friend there, but I was like, oh shit, this feels like high school. And I think that like in the working world, we just get no training in school on how to relate to other people. No. And I wonder if and I think that's a problem, because I think we often don't relate to each other very well. We don't do very well conflict resolution. So is that something that is maybe not a part of that default school setting that you think a lot about in your school?
Yes. Okay. So we are learning social skills, right? In the default school setting. Of course we are, right?
Yeah,
we're having
just by doing it.
But what can happen is without guidance, right? It's like the Lord of the Flies, right? Without the guidance, then what happens is maybe the more powerful one's making the rules all the time and somebody else is having to acquiesce or submit, or, right? There's unhealthy ways that we can start interacting. In a smaller setting, and this is one of the things I am talking with our teachers about all the time, is that in this school where we have 6 right now, we'll have 8 next year. And that's our max. So we're micro school. Right now we're taking 8 kids. 8 kids that hopefully will like each other to Max's point. Okay. But we will work it out with them is the thing. Yes, they're going to have conflict. There's going to be personality conflict. And you know what they don't get to do in our setting, for better or worse? They don't get to just decide not to deal with that. I'm going to go over here and deal with this other group. No, more like in a family, we got to work it out, but we're there to really support them working it out. And so we don't have to rush past it. So there is one of the things that we do is like recess is not the time for the teacher to lesson plan while we send all the rest of them out. And the rule is they just can't, kill each other, right? Somebody is there not to micromanage. That's the other piece, like how to find the balance in that, not to micromanage their play. But when there is conflict, they're learning, how do we make repair? What does it mean to actually listen to somebody else about how your behavior affected them, really hear it, make an apology, and then not just an apology, but a repair, have a do-over about it. So we handle even consequences differently. We do not do point systems. We do not I say to kids all the time, we're talking about the difference between a punishment, which sometimes they have to happen, and a consequence. And a lot of times the consequence is that we spend time working this out until we come up with a different way to do this and really work through it. What happens in a setting where there's more kids, and I know because I'm there sometimes, right? Like I've been in the settings where I've got a whole bunch of kids, is that rather than work through this thing that just happened, you say, you know what? Clearly y'all are not controlling yourselves very well with those Nerf guns, and so we just take away the Nerf guns. Instead of stopping, figuring out what the problem was, and then finding a better way to be playing with the Nerf guns or whatever it is, right? We tend to take away what causes a problem in that more a public or default setting where we have less time, we have testing that we need to do, and we've got like 25 or 30 kids. Of course we do, because that's what you have to do there. When you're in a smaller setting, you can go, you know what? That means we may not get to math today, but I think our social development and how to actually handle conflict, which I'm with you, Matt, we adults don't know how to handle conflict. I mean, we start figuring that we get married and start figuring out how to handle conflict, and everybody's in.
Yeah.
It's hard. And
Yeah.
so, and I will watch the kids with a little dynamic, and I'll be watching thinking, oh, someday in your marriage, that dynamic's going to be real bad. We get to stop and have time. We get to sit with it and be with it.
Yeah.
And really learn how to like regulate your nervous system is the other piece, right? We're able to do it differently. We're able to, I'm able to, with the kids, notice the difference between when they need movement that's organizing versus activating to bring more focus versus, I got the little thing.
Yeah,
from
you
my
got
thumb,
the thumbs up.
versus calming, right? Like how to listen to what your body needs and go, oh, actually at this moment, what it is anxiety. And I need 3 minutes, in a rocking chair for a minute doing a meditation. Versus most of our kids are really needing more like how to come into like more organized focus, which is still requires your body to come in, right? It's not a 20-minute break for that. It's a 2 to 3 minute break for that. And then you get back to the math or whatever it was, right? So you just have more time in a more individualized way to help kids with what we would call in public school setting, social emotional learning. And social emotional learning is not a class. That's the problem, is that a lot of times it's sort of a class in a public school setting, right?
It's
They
life.
can learn about it. It's life and it's happening all the time.
Yeah.
And we have the ability to, in a smaller setting, we have the ability to really get in there and work it out. Because I think what happens when your kid comes home and they've had conflict at public school, as the parent, of course, you're going to, in this case too, I'm not with my kids all day. I'm going to talk about it, but we're talking about it after the fact. And that's not experiential. And actually, they do not have the brain capacity. That's abstract. Abstract learning happens at like 22, that it really kicks in. So when we say, let's talk about what happened, and let's discuss what you could do in the future moving forward in a similar situation, that's very abstract. And a lot of kids don't have very good brain capacity to do it. We're teaching them.
Yeah.
How-
Yeah. I always
But
wonder with my 7-year-old, and particularly with my 2-year-old, when we talk about it afterwards, I'm like, we doing anything here? Like, you're watching me talk. I don't know. Is this going to, I think we probably talk through things maybe too much. in our house.
I think it can work if you do like role playing to really kind of relive it or something. But really, I think just to keep it at a high level for the listeners here, I feel like nothing you're really saying is really about the whole system as a whole. It's more just like, you're really good at that and you'd be awesome. Like, obviously, like you can, if you're, one on the ratio 6 to 1 or 8 to 1, you can do a much better job with 6 to 8 kids as opposed to 500 kids. But what I'd say is like, I just don't want listeners to come away and say, oh, this sounds awesome because Bettina is like the fucking man. And now I'm going to go to this micro school and my kid is like getting fucking screamed at. And it's like 6 to 1 with, Trunchbull from Matilda putting me in the chokey.
Nice Trunchbull reference.
Nice. I mean, you know what I mean? It's like, I think what's more interesting is like that sort of conflict resolution, talking about that, because that's it. But I think, what if you're just a little shining light in the micro school movement?
Yeah, you know what? We did have a very negative experience in a micro school, actually. Yeah. So it's not that they're all the best, right? It's what it is that there is a huge movement. So let me say this real quick. We have homeschool co-op, hybrid homeschool, micro school, and then I'll make up the term hybrid micro school.
Okay.
Like why we're doing a micro school, except that's it. We're really, once we get accredited, we'll be a micro school, but we'll still have parents doing part of the schooling. And then private school, and then public, right? Like that's sort of the.
And then there's also like charters in there, sort of like charters are kind of public, but like kind of different.
Maybe between
Yeah,
private and public.
that's kind of, and maybe that's kind of, but there's a huge, across the United States, it's like this grassroots revolution that's occurred. I mean, it's this thing where people have started to do these micro schools, and usually The micro school movement, as opposed to the homeschool world. So the homeschool world started out being often about religion.
Mm-hmm.
The micro school movement is not about religion most of the time. The micro school movement is about doing education differently.
Mm-hmm.
It's about learning being more project-based, more inquiry-based. It's about teaching kids to love learning and how to learn. And it's about even being a little more minimalistic in the learning so we can go deeper, right?
Okay.
So maybe I'm not doing 7 subjects a day. I'm covering 3 or 4, but we're going deeper with
Here's
it.
a question for somebody who's maybe considering a micro school or maybe even a charter school or considering a school and they have some sort of interaction with the administration or some teachers or whatever. What are maybe some things to ask so that, they end up at, if they want a micro school, a school like yours, as opposed to maybe the one that you tried that wasn't good, because
Trunchbull school for naughty children. Yeah.
Right, because it could be hard because it's like sometimes people can present really well, like especially like interviewing salespeople is very hard because salespeople are good at interviewing, and so you can get like kind of someone like, oh, we're so whatever, but then you ask this question, it's like, oh my gosh, this is like an incredibly permissive, like free school where they're borderline, smoking weed in the back. As opposed to like, oh, and this one's too strict. Like, how do you find that Goldilocks, like a secure attachment, but also not like willy nilly. We do whatever the fuck we want here.
Mm-hmm.
You have to just do it yourself. No, I'm just kidding. I was going to say, do it yourself.
Just start a school, Max.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. No, okay. So, because this is another thing that you're going to notice in the micro schools is, and it was my one of the problems I had was the schools that allowed lots of movement and nature and all of the things I know our body needs, often I also didn't feel they were rigorous enough in the education itself, right? And so there are a few questions to ask. So one is, I'm going to ask questions about what are you doing in this school for nervous system regulation? They ought to know something about that and what they're doing intentionally to help the nervous system regulate. Now, that's not going to be the educational part yet. Then the other is, talk to me about your philosophy in education. They should be able to answer the question, right? Is there a certain curriculum most of the kids use? How do you individualize? They should be able to say, well, here's what we might do for math for different kids. Like, how do you individualize the work that they're doing? Asking about their daily rhythm is a question people should be able to answer. Like we can say that we know kids need to do deep learning for, depending on the kid, 20 to about 45 minutes. And then they need at least 3 to 5 minutes of a break in order to regulate their body again, come back into focus, right? And then go back into deeper learning, right? And so schools should be able to talk about their rhythm. They should be able to talk about their learning philosophy and why they're using it. They should know the difference between what is more public education and what is unit-based learning or project-based learning or living books, pulling certain books into the process. They should know the different educational philosophies out there and what they're doing. So the struggle I've found is a lot of people you can't do all of them for every single kid. That's what you can't do, right? So individualized does not mean this kid's doing more public and this one's doing more Montessori and this one's doing, you can't do that. They have to pick an educational philosophy. They ought to know. So, because the danger in a lot of the micro schools and what people are worried about, and I was too, is that we've started a school, they're not accredited, there's no accountability, and do they know what they're doing at all, right? And so being prepared with those questions, I think, is important.
This episode of Milkless is brought to you by Viola Archer in the case of the Purple Martin. Thank you. Bye.